You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
General Lyman Lemnitzer comes to the White House just after the NATO Council unanimously approves his appointment as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. President Kennedy greets General Lemnitzer and General Maxwell D. Taylor. The White House military advisor is named to succeed Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's highest military official.
Author Webster Tarpley wrote, "Above all else, Kennedy was acting like a man who thought he was president."
I'm confident the challenges of the future will be met as they have been met in the past. And because of this confidence, I wish to salute all SAC personnel on our 10th anniversary for their past and future contribution to peace through global air power.
At one point, the cigar LeMay told his personal aide that the Kennedys were parasites that should be stepped on and crushed like the cockroaches that they were.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.
In Kennedy's 1960 campaign, he launched an ideological war against communism.
Communist influence has penetrated into Asia. It stands in the Middle East and now festers some 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Cuba in particular was a festering thorn in his side.
Castro and his fellow dictators may rule nations, they do not rule people.
This is Mayor Earl Cabell of Dallas, Texas, a town that's getting ready the city that's getting ready for the visit very shortly of the President of the United States.
Jumped across for you. Oh, what a thing to do. 'Cause you were all yellow. I drew a line for you. Oh, what a thing to do. And it was all yellow.
I was questioned by a judge. However, I protested at that time that I was not allowed legal representation.
In bringing Oswald out, they were, of course, doing something that you would never see happen today. But they were trying to cooperate with the press with the understanding that there would not be questions shouted at him.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
You have been.
Nobody said what?
Sir?
You have been.
Nobody said what? Okay, we can't hear you. Okay.
What did you do in Russia?
Here he comes.
Now the prisoner wearing the white sweater is changed from his t-shirt.
Let me have it. I want it.
Being let out by Captain Fritz. There is the prisoner.
There is Lee. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's a man with a gun. Absolute panic. Absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. The detectives have their guns drawn. There is no question about it. Oswald has been shot at point-blank range, fired into his stomach.
After having gone through the events of today, frankly, I'm still in a state of shock, and it's hard to collect my thoughts and to be coherent. It's indescribable.
What will that do to Dallas, Mayor?
I don't think that this will hurt Dallas as a city, because I believe that the people of the nation realize that this was not an act of Dallas, not an act of the true thinking of Dallas. This was the act of a maniac. And this maniac could just as well have lived in Miami, could have lived in New York, St. Louis, or anywhere else. This was one of those unusual, maniacal acts that necessarily did not belong to any one city. I cannot point my finger at any individual or even group of individuals in Dallas that would knowingly have incited or perpetrated any such act as this.
I was a hospital corpsman, United States Navy, and I was stationed in Bethesda, Maryland.
At Bethesda Hospital where the president was brought?
Yes, sir.
Were you present when they brought the president in?
Yes, sir.
Who else was there in that autopsy room? Describe the scene just so the jury can see it in their own eyes.
Well, you have to imagine what the autopsy room looked like. It was quite large, had an amphitheater. It was used for teaching.
All right.
Pathology. The room was full of Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, high-ranking officers, civilians. It was jam-packed.
All right. Did you? What was the attitudes of the people? Was it calm?
No.
What was it?
It was very hysterical.
Was Dr. Hume receiving any interference in what he was doing?
We were interfered with constantly, yes.
And who was interfering with what was going on?
Well, there was Admiral Berkeley, the president's physician at the time.
What was he doing?
He just interfered constantly. We'd go to do a procedure, and he'd say, "No, let's don't do that. Let's do something else." Or the Kennedy family wouldn't like that, or it was on and on like that all the time.
Now, when the president came in, what did you do?
The casket came in at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening. They set the casket on the floor beside the table, and we opened the casket. Inside was a body bag. The body bag was unzipped, and we removed the president's body and placed it on the table.
Did you help do that?
Yes.
Did you have your hands on him?
Yes.
At what part of his body, sir?
His shoulders.
All right. You were at the head end.
Yes.
Well, now let's just describe to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you were prepared to do. What were you prepared to do?
Prepare the body, remove the brain. And
you were prepared to remove the brain?
Yes.
And would you tell the jury how that's done, please?
In order to remove a brain from a deceased person, you have to make an incision that goes from ear across the top of the head to ear. Then the scalp is slowly peeled back until it's hooked under the chin on the front. The scalp is retracted in the back the same way. You then cut the temporal muscles on both sides. You have two sets of muscles on both sides called temporal muscles. They're cut. Then I used a saw and sawed completely around the top of the cranium.
And then what, sir?
You take a small chisel and you pry the cranium loose and open up the top of the skull where you have the dura mater, which is a tough, fibrous membrane that covers the brain. That's then cut with a pair of scissors all the way around close to where you've done the cutting with a saw. That exposes the whole top of the brain. At that time, you reach in very gently with your left hand and you pull up the front of the brain and cut the optic nerves and other nerves and veins and arteries that hold and support the cranium, the brain in the cranium.
All right, now, Mr. O'Connor, in this case, we have developed some facts that when these doctors who testified here came before this jury to testify, they were never shown a brain. Although they were told there had been a brain placed in a bucket of formaldehyde, but they never were shown the brain. Do you have an explanation for that?
Yes, I do.
Would you tell the jury what the explanation is?
The president's brains were literally blown out of his head. He had none.
Are you saying that there was no brain in the president's head?
There was no brain. There were pieces of brain matter that were inside the cranium, just macerated pieces. Nothing that you could tell one part from the other.
Well, what do you mean there were pieces? How much of the brain was left in the skull?
Maybe a handful at the most.
You mean a full handful or what?
Maybe a half a handful.
Now, did you open the president's brain as you would in an ordinary case?
We didn't have to.
You mean you didn't peel the president's brain back?
No, sir. No, there was nothing to do. He had a monstrous hole in his head.
And so there was never a cut around or the hole or the brain taken out?
We didn't have to.
Because the brain wasn't there?
The brain was gone for all practical purposes. It was gone.
Well, when these people draw pictures of the brain, when these people say that there were pictures taken, photographs taken of the brain, what do you have to say about that?
They must be talking about somebody else.
Well, were you at the head of the president all during the time the autopsy was taken?
The whole time.
When people say that the brain was fixed in formaldehyde, is that true?
No.
Is that a lie, sir?
It has to be. There's no brain.
Thank you, sir. You may examine.
Mr. O'Connor, you were 21 at the time, sir? The time of the incident?
21 or 22. I'm not really sure right now, sir.
I have no doubt, Mr. O'Connor, that in a normal situation it would be you who would remove the brain from the decedent, but this obviously and unquestionably was not a normal situation. You certainly agree with me on that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is it possible then that the autopsy surgeons would have done this, as opposed to you, in this situation, since it was so unusual?
Well, they did most of the mundane jobs that we did that night.
Okay. But they did not remove the brain from the body?
There was no brain to be removed.
The official autopsy report in this case, Mr. O'Connor, dated November the 22nd, 1963, states on page 4, the brain is removed and preserved for further study following formalin fixation. Also, from the surface of the disrupted right cerebral cortex, 2 small irregularly shaped fragments of metal are recovered. These measure 7 by 2 millimeters and 3 by 1 millimeter. These are placed in the custody of agents Francis X. O'Neill, Jr. and James W. Siebert of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who executed a receipt therefor. Now, Mr. O'Connor, 3 surgeons signed their name to this autopsy report. Are you saying that none of these things happened?
Not to my knowledge, they didn't.
Okay. Now, would you agree, Mr. O'Connor, that the president arriving at Bethesda Hospital with his brain already having been removed is one of the most shocking things that you've ever seen in your whole life?
Not the most, but one of the most.
Okay, certainly one of the most.
Yes.
And it goes without saying that you felt this is something that should have been investigated, right?
Well, I figured it would be.
Okay. In fact, throughout the years, you've often wondered what the answer to it was, right?
Oh, I still have questions.
Now, in 1978, you were interviewed by the House Select Committee on Assassination. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And this was a 1.5-hour interview.
Yes, as I can remember.
Pretty much in depth, right?
Yes, sir.
They wanted to know about your observations that night, right?
That's right.
They want to talk to everyone who had anything to do with this matter.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, Mr. O'Connor, if the president's brain being missing from his head is one of the most shocking things that you've ever seen in your entire life, a matter that you think should have been investigated, certainly, and if they spoke to you for 1.5 hours about your observations that night, why wasn't it important enough for you to tell these people about it?
I was under orders not to talk until that time.
What?
I was under orders not to talk to anybody.
By whom?
By the United States military brought in orders a couple of days after the autopsy, and we were to remain silent.
But you talked to them for 1.5 hours. You told them all types of things in that document.
I received permission from the Select Committee on Assassinations to talk through the Secretary of Navy and Secretary of Defense.
Paul, when I first asked you this question over the phone, did you tell me the reason I never told them is they never asked me?
Well, they didn't ask me.
And that's why you didn't tell them?
Yes.
As far as I'm aware, on that particular situation, it was William K. Harvey who was in touch with John Roselli, and it was Harvey and Roselli who were attempting to find, if I understood it correctly, some channel from Florida into Havana.
Why was Harvey under investigation? William King Harvey, known throughout intelligence as the American James Bond, was assigned by Deputy Director Richard Bissell and Director of Plans Richard Helms to head an executive action program for the CIA, which was created to develop assassination attempts against foreign leaders. A mysterious man who was rarely photographed, William Harvey was famous for building a tunnel into Soviet territory in Berlin, what became known as Harvey's Hole. He was on a fast track at the CIA, destined for a role at the top of the agency.
He had a great reputation for building a tunnel in Berlin, which produced a lot of information, though there's some suspicion now, based on newly available Soviet documents, that the KGB knew about the tunnel and was using it as a means of sending disinformation to the West. He was a heavy drinker, and he had a reputation of being a bull in a china shop.
Harvey had held many positions over the years that made him suspicious to the committee. Besides his relationship with Roselli, he was one of only 3 people involved in a covert program to send false defectors into the Soviet Union, and was undoubtedly aware of Oswald's defection. As head of the Executive Action Program to assassinate Castro, he developed a profile of the ideal assassin. In his handwritten notes for the program, codenamed ZR Rifle, he defines the ideal assassin as a person with communist credentials that can be used if the cover is blown.
I talked to Harvey, and he told me that he trusted Johnny Roselli, that I could believe Johnny Roselli after I filled him in on some of the things Roselli had told me. And he confirmed, very reluctantly. It took me not 5 years, but it took me quite a while to get William Harvey to talk to me. when he did talk to me, he confirmed Roselli's story.
Finally, Harvey hated the Kennedys. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, he had a confrontation with Bobby Kennedy that virtually ended his career, exiling him to an intelligence station in Rome.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, everything was extremely tense, and suddenly it was discovered that Harvey had sent a team of people into Cuba, and the Kennedys were very concerned that this crisis might explode into nuclear war. And Robert Kennedy particularly was in a rage when he heard that this loose cannon had added a further element of unpredictability to the situation.
I mean, we had a terrible experience with the ones that were handling it at the time of the missile crisis. They were going to send 60 people into Cuba right during the missile crisis. Nobody knew what they were doing. They never taught. They explained. I just heard about it because one of the fellows who was going to go wrote me or got in touch with me and said, we don't mind going, but we want to make sure we're going because you think it's worthwhile. And I checked into it. Nobody knew about it. And then the CIA didn't. The top officials didn't, and we pinned it down to the fellow who was supposed to. He was supposed to be in charge, and he said we planned it because the military wanted it done. And I asked the military, and they never heard of it.
Oh my God.
This is the same fellow who put the tunnel under Berlin, and so he was. You remember that tunnel, 1948? They constructed a tunnel under and built it up into the intelligence office of the.
Yeah.
Which was a hell of a project.
Yeah.
But he did that better than he did this. Of course, I was furious because I said you were dealing with people's lives. And the best of the Cubans, and they're the ones that volunteer, and then you're going to go off with a half-ass operation such as this. We had a meeting at the Pentagon on it. I've never seen him since.
Bill Harvey, in the CIA fashion, instead of being retired as he should have been, was sent as station chief in Rome, where I believe he drank himself to death, or at least into retirement.
As the House committee would learn, Harvey maintained his friendship with Johnny Roselli long after his exile to Rome. It was this connection that was of serious interest to the committee, and they wanted to ask Harvey about it. Unfortunately, Harvey died of a massive heart attack within weeks of his scheduled testimony.
You know, Bobby Kennedy and my husband were absolutely enemies. I mean, just pure enemies.
Well, from the sound, and not just from what I've heard reading through you and heard from you, but Bobby was, from all other sources, Bobby was not a real bright man on things.
He was an idiot.
Okay.
They went from genius to idiot,
Yeah.
and he was at the idiot end of the scale. And he really was very narrow, and he did not have a very good philosophy, and he had no confidence in himself because his brother put him in a job that he wasn't really capable of handling. It made a lot of stress for the people who were working in law enforcement. I loved Roselli. My husband always said if I had to ride shotgun, that's the guy I'd take with me. Much better than any of the law enforcement people. Roselli was the kind of guy that if he gave you his desires and his friendship, well, he was going to stick by you.
No matter what.
Yeah.
Loyal.
And he definitely was mafia, and he definitely was a crook,
Mm-hmm.
and he definitely had pulled off all kinds of stunts with the mafia, but he was a patriot. He believed in the United States, and he knew that my husband was a patriot, and that's what drew him to Bill. And he had been recruited by another guy from the FBI for assassination purposes on Kennedy, or on Castro.
The Intelligence Committee said today that the CIA illegally opened and read the mail of several prominent Americans, including one letter to Richard Nixon. It occurred during a 20-year program of intercepting mail crossing the Iron Curtain. The man who ran that program, James Angleton, testified today. Daniel Shore reports.
Slowed down a bit by ulcer medication, Angleton, the legendary counterintelligence chief, had no apology to make for an admittedly illegal 20-year program of opening mail between the U.S. and Russia, a program that went beyond looking for communist intelligence. For, as Senator Church disclosed, letters were also being opened and photographed for a special CIA file marked Selected American Politicians. That file included a June 1968 letter to Richard Nixon in New York from his speechwriter Ray Price, traveling in Moscow, discussing his coming candidacy. A 1958 letter from Senator Hubert Humphrey, then in Moscow. This 1968 letter to Senator Edward Kennedy from a Soviet citizen in Armenia talking about a U.S.-Soviet health exchange. Senator Church's own letter from Moscow in 1971 to his mother-in-law, and mail to and from Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Martin Luther King, Harvard University, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations.
This kind of either surveillance or interference on any correspondence to officials or to any Americans, I think, is I think, extremely unfortunate.
We believe that it was extremely important to know everything possible regarding contacts of American citizens with communist countries.
What counterintelligence objective was it thought you were achieving in opening the mail of what most of us would assume to be very patriotic, thoughtful, decent Americans?
Sir, I would prefer, if possible, to respond to that question in executive session.
Angleton didn't reply today, but did confirm what former Nixon aide Tom Charles Houston testified yesterday, that in 1970, when President Nixon was considering permitting postal snooping, the CIA and FBI concealed from him that had been going on for 18 years.
What possible justification was there to misrepresent a matter of such importance to the Commander-in-Chief?
I have no satisfactory answer to your question.
Didn't the CIA have an affirmative duty to inform the President about such a program?
I believe so, without any question.
The committee later agreed to try to arrange for testimony from Mr. Nixon on this and other issues.
Mr. Nixon was the central figure.
The new book is written by journalist and historian David Talbot, the founder and former CEO and editor-in-chief of Salon. The book examines the life and legacy of Allen Dulles, the longest-serving CIA director. He held the position from 1953 to 61, but his influence is still felt at the agency. Under his watch, the CIA overthrew the governments of Iran and Guatemala in 1953 and 1954, invaded Cuba, and was tied to the killing of Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected leader. During part one of our conversation, I asked David Talbot about the 1953 coup in Iran and the 61 murder of Patrice Lumumba. Part two of our interview begins with Guatemala. The ramifications of the CIA's 1954 coup are still being felt in Guatemala, where voters will go to the polls next Sunday to elect a new president. Last month, President Otto Pérez Molina resigned and was jailed following a popular uprising. I asked David Talbot to talk about the 54 coup and the role played by Allen Dulles and his brother, John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State at the time.
Yes, when Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba, he again antagonizes the same corporate interests that Dulles brothers represent, oil companies like the Rockefeller-owned Standard Oil and others, agribusiness firms. So they believe that Fidel has to be eliminated. And they begin plotting under the Eisenhower administration, with Eisenhower's approval, to assassinate Fidel Castro. And in fact, at one point, Fidel Castro, who was beloved in this country after the revolution, he had overthrown a thug, a mafia-backed thug, Batista, a very corrupt and violent dictatorship. He was seen as the future and very glamorous, he and Che Guevara and so on. They would come to New York and would be mobbed by people in the streets. Kennedy did do a flip-flop to an extent after that. He came in as president. He was young. He was untested, under a lot of pressure from the national security people in his administration. He inherited the Bay of Pigs operation, the plans for that. He was basically told, look, if you pull the plug on this thing, it's so far along now, there'll be a major political backlash against you. So he was kind of sandbagged by the CIA. He did go through with it, but he had no intention of widening it into an all-out U.S. military assault on the island, on Cuba. But that's what the CIA had in mind. They knew that this motley crew of Cuban exiles they'd put together to invade the island wasn't sufficient to unseat Castro. But what they hoped and what they planned was that a young President Kennedy, as this invasion was bogged down on the beaches at the Bay of Pigs, would be forced then to send in the Marines and the U.S. Air Force to topple Castro.
After early attempts to kill Castro failed, the CIA turned to more devious methods. Enter Marita Lorenz, Fidel Castro's mistress.
By chance, I went on my father's cruise ship, the Berlin. The last stop on this cruise, West Indian cruise, was Havana. And on this cruise, I met the Prime Minister of Cuba, Dr. Fidel Castro Ruz.
She was 19 years old and a real beauty. Fidel, naturally, with a 19-year-old girl, hey, you know, he'd crawl over a snake to get to a 19-year-old girl.
At 19, she was old enough to have an affair with Fidel and young enough to be brainwashed by the CIA.
I was asked to try to recruit her because she would be a very good asset, intelligence-wise. And I nurtured her along, and I finally did, where I got her in a position to poison Castro.
They kept threatening me since they trained me that I wasn't good for anything else, that I had to do it for national security reasons, that otherwise there would be a war.
She failed in that. And then there was 2 other attempts.
I saw him playing his music and lying on the bed, smoking a cigar. He said, "Did you come to kill me?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You can't kill me. Nobody can kill me."
Though the CIA had been unable to liquidate Castro, they pushed ahead with plans for an all-out invasion. The Bay of Pigs was the disastrous result.
Jack Kennedy did inherit the Bay of Pigs scenario. He had made certain pledges during the campaign. He had chided Nixon for not being tough enough on Castro, and he was determined to show that he was a tough guy that wasn't going to tolerate this dictator 90 miles offshore.
Promises had been made by the administration, by the Kennedy administration and by the preceding Eisenhower administration, that the invasion would proceed under certain circumstances. And when that vow was broken, I only interpreted it on the part of Mr. Kennedy as a failure of nerve.
He was scared because Khrushchev says, "Don't do this or we're going to do that." You know, so he didn't do it, and he deserted the Bay of Pigs. I was involved in the Bay of Pigs. Got a lot of people, friends of mine, that were killed in the Bay of Pigs. And I resent that. Don't play political games with me. I'm a military man. I'm a soldier. I go fight. But damn it, if I risk my ass out there and I'm getting shot at, I don't want some stupid-ass politician to go ahead and make deals behind my back where my people, or maybe myself, are going to get killed. I don't like that.
After the Bay of Pigs, John F. Kennedy angrily said that he was going to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces. I'd like you to respond to that.
I think that for him to have said that was probably a way of disguising from himself the fact that he himself was responsible for the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs. And I'm sure that that's something that haunted him for the rest of his days.
In 1975, Hunt, Sturgis, and Barker were sentenced to prison for political espionage in the Watergate break-in that forced the resignation of President Richard Nixon.
There was nobody with the leverage that LBJ had, no competitor. He was the vice president, and if he wanted to get rid of the president, then he had ability to do so by corrupting different people in the CIA. And he had to do it with the limitations of CIA because there was no other group that honored, if I could use that term, honored the clandestine limitations the way CIA did. They could do something, turn their back on it, and move on to something else. It was not like a military. There was no accounting in that sense. And we know that LBJ had an unlimited ambition. And we know that he was a corrupt individual. And that the dollar sign was very important to him. As vice president, he didn't have the leverage that a president did or would. And so that was an attractive goal for LBJ. He did not want his career to come to an end as vice president. Who knows about vice presidents? It was very, very important to him that he take advantage as to the extent that he could as vice president, because just a few things had to be accomplished. He had to kill Kennedy, have him killed, I should say, and be guilt-free himself. And then he could go on and do what he wanted to do as President of the United States. It was a very tempting and almost illogical move on his part. I keep thinking about Bill Harvey. Call Harvey and say, look, there's some things I want to have done. I mean, Harvey didn't want just an additional CIA salary. He wanted to move on. And LBJ could do that for him if he were president.
Right.
He couldn't do much for Harvey or anybody as vice president. That was why he used Harvey as being available and corrupt. It was very easy for even the vice president to start working with Harvey or anybody else. Just say, I want you to do this, I want you to do that. And making sure that they had money that was not their own to do whatever the LBJ wanted to have done. So that when the president was assassinated, the vice president was right there and ready to move along. It doesn't speak well for our democracy at that particular time. He, in my opinion, had an almost maniacal urge to become president. He regarded JFK as he was, in fact, an obstacle to achieving that. Harvey was just a very strange and complicated individual. A lot of people have sort of suggested that he was, that alcohol had taken control of him. First of all, he never should have been put in that position. I don't think that he had a pristine connection with anybody. Always had a gun on him, yeah. Particularly in Rome. Harvey even carried guns into restaurants, and he would pull them out, slap them down on the table to the dismay of other diners, and then he'd settle down to an afternoon of drinking, not eating much, but because he was way overweight, but certainly drinking. He had been a deputy to Angleton and very deeply involved in counter-espionage activities.
Well, Harvey had written in a memo at one point when he was running the Executive Action Program that he wanted to use Corsicans.
Yeah, wanted to use what?
Corsicans.
Yeah.
As hitmen. Do you think it's possible that when he was in Rome that he might have recruited a Corsican assassin to kill Kennedy?
Yes. It is possible. I mean, it's one thing to set yourself up in splendid isolation, and it's another thing to use that isolation as a tool, right, so that you're not an immediate suspect in the case of a capital crime.
Right, right, because he was in Rome.
Is that understandable?
Yeah,
okay.
Very. My understanding is that Harvey had a very severe clash with Bobby Kennedy around the time of the missile crisis, and that Kennedy basically
I think it was
said,
earlier than that. And he posted an old slogan somewhere in the agency premises that said, the tree of liberty must be nourished by the blooded patriots. And this incensed Bobby Kennedy. And they clashed on that particular point. Seems ridiculous. You would think that Bobby would have embraced that particular philosophy, but he did not. And I guess he figured that Harvey was trying to steal some of the glory of whatever was going on in those days.
Never before in American history has one family held such an enormous concentration of political power. The plan is perfectly plain: to retain and perpetuate this power for decades. 2 terms for JFK, 2 for Bobby, and 2 for Ted. And in each administration, the brothers who are not president would take over the most powerful cabinet posts. They have several $100 million and some of the best brains on earth to carry it through. They have put together a powerful coalition of big city machines, labor, Negroes, Jews, liberals, and the press that will make him unbeatable in 1964.
Wait a minute, Professor. He's appointed Republicans to the Treasury, to the Navy. Another is head of the CIA. My brother Bobby worked on Joe McCarthy's committee. The old man is further to the right than I am.
Ancient history, Harold. The man's come out for cuts on the oil depletion allowance. He's stopping mergers under the Antitrust Act. He promises to close down 52 domestic and 25 overseas military bases.
Foster, since when you believe the promises of politicians, especially in an election year?
Times have changed, Mr. Ferguson, and tactics along with them. In the next few months, you're going to see JFK do the following. 1, he's going to lead the Black Revolution instead of fighting it. Now, we all know what that means, don't we?
Damn right, a white backlash. Federal troops backing up the blacks, blood in the streets.
2, he's going to try to put across a test ban treaty with the Russians. And 3, he's going to try to pull out of Vietnam and turn Asia over to the communists.
Ridiculous. The American public would never stand for that.
Come on, Harold. The American public will stand for what it has to stand for, what it's told to stand for, or what it's educated to stand for.
Done effectively, the public would soon be disenchanted with the war.
Which would make action imperative.
So we've determined that our action can best be carried out during a motorcade.
How so?
Because they're scheduled well in advance. And they give you a chance to fire from cover and get away in the confusion.
How do you select your operatives?
I can tell you, Harold, now in the old days you used to have to train your own men from the ground up, keep them on your payroll the rest of their lives. No more.
Wow. You know how many men were fired by the CIA after the Bay of Pigs fiasco? There's a small army of anti-Castro Cubans. They're all available. They can do anything, from picking a lock and bugging an embassy to taking care of an ambassador.
So, how many of them do you need?
A team of 3 men. I've had 2 teams in the field for over a month.
Why 2?
1 team will be selected for action, the other for backup and getaway. These are all men I've used before, Harold. Trained, reliable, professional. Now, 1 man firing from long range at a moving target is out of the question. Even with 2 men, we found the percentages of failure are too high. The only possible scenario is 3 rifles with triangulated fire. 2 firing at a retreating target, and the 3rd firing as the target advances.
Well, you see, Willard, in this war, things get confused out there. Power, ideals, the old morality, and practical military necessity. But out there with these natives, it must be a temptation to be God. Because there's a conflict in every human heart between the rational and the irrational, between good and evil. And good does not always triumph. Sometimes the dark side overcomes what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. Every man has got a breaking point. You and I have them. Walt Kurtz has reached his. And very obviously he has gone insane.
Yes, sir. Very much so, sir. It's obviously insane.
Your mission is to proceed up the Nung River in a Navy patrol boat. Pick up Colonel Kurtz's path at New Mung Ba. Follow it, learn what you can along the way. When you find the colonel, infiltrate his team by whatever means available, and terminate the colonel's command.
Terminate the colonel.
He's out there operating without any decent restraint, totally beyond the pale of any acceptable human conduct. And he is still in the field commanding troops.
Terminate with extreme prejudice.
You understand, Captain, that this mission does not exist, nor will it ever exist.
That's shot him down, and so mainstream historians really beginning to understand how much at odds President Kennedy was with his own national security establishment. It wasn't just the CIA he was at war with after the Bay of Pigs, it was his own Pentagon. So I think that's when the veto was cast on his life, his decision not to invade. And of course, today we should all be very grateful because we learned 29 years after the crisis what we didn't know then. We learned 29 years later that, not only did the Russians have medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, strategic weapons with nuclear warheads on them, but they also had 102 battlefield nuclear weapons. We didn't even know that in 1963. 102 battlefield nuclear weapons. 12 of them were Luna missiles with 2-kiloton warheads. That's a small nuclear yield, but it would still destroy a lot of ships at sea or destroy a lot of troops on the beach. They had 12 of those. They had 80 cruise missiles that were the size of a kind of a scaled-down robot MiG airplane with Hiroshima-sized bombs in them. And they were designed to be fired at, for example, like Guantanamo Naval Base. They were going to fire 3 of them at Guantanamo if we invaded. They would have been fired at the invasion beaches themselves. They had 80 of those things. And then they had 6 nuclear bombs that could have been delivered by IL-28 bombers. So and 4 nuclear mines for underwater. So they had a total of 102 tactical nukes. When those things were put in Cuba to protect the Russian missiles, the commanders in Cuba, the Russian commanders, were told, you have permission to use these tactical weapons on your own authority if there's an invasion that begins and you cannot contact Moscow. You have permission to use the weapons. And that was their mindset the whole time, was that if the Americans invade, we're going to fry them to protect our own strategic nuclear missiles. And we didn't know that. And so all these people like Curtis LeMay and even Chairman Maxwell Taylor, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he wanted to invade and bomb. LeMay, all the Joint Chiefs supported bombing and an invasion, and many of Kennedy's key civilian advisors had become resigned to doing it. By the time October 27th rolled around, probably the worst day of the missile crisis, Saturday the 27th, McNamara himself and others had become resigned to the fact that it's going to happen. We're going to have to invade and bomb. And Kennedy found a diplomatic solution. And so, we all avoided disaster by a human hair, because if the American invasion fleet had been fried at sea with nuclear weapons, and if the American Marines and and Army divisions had been fried on the beach, and if Guantanamo had been destroyed by these 3 FKR cruise missiles that were going to be launched if we invaded, we would have had World War III, because we would have had to retaliate somewhere against the Soviet Union, and then that would have been it. And we know now that if we had destroyed half the planet with our overwhelming nuclear arsenal, the whole planet would have gone into nuclear winter. Not only would there have been tremendous nuclear fallout, causing mutations and sickness for generations, but the world's, because of all the smoke and ash from all the nuclear fires, nuclear explosions, and the burned cities, the Earth's would have been, all the sunlight would have been blocked from the Earth for at least 4 or 5 years. Temperatures would have fallen, plant life would have died, and the food chain would have been destroyed. So it would have been a global catastrophe. Even if the Russians had not destroyed one U.S. city, even if we had gone completely unscathed, half the planet would have been destroyed, and that would have been it for Western civilization, human civilization on the planet Earth. And so we should all be grateful that Kennedy found a diplomatic solution. When McNamara found out about all the technical nuclear weapons in Cuba, 29 years later, I saw him in tears. He was in tears on Larry King on CNN. He was that shaken. Kennedy was lectured on the advantages of doing a preemptive first strike on the Soviet Union. We can nuke these guys. We have such a tremendous superiority over them in nuclear weapons. We can wipe them out in a first strike and get rid of our adversary forever. And, he rejected that twice. He rejected it in 61 and again in 63. By the time they learned about his approaches to Castro, his secret approaches to Castro in September and October, the assassination plot was already long ago in motion.
And also that doesn't get a lot of publicity is the unprecedented move to end the space race and go cooperatively, jointly to the moon.
That's correct. And, I'm a space buff, and I love the Apollo space program. I'm a historian of the Apollo program. I have every book that you could ever purchase about it, every piece of film. And I didn't know about that until I saw Oliver Stone's movie. And so I said to myself, I got to check this out. I don't know if that's true or not. And it is true. Kennedy went before the United Nations in September of 1963. And he proposed, instead of having a race, why don't we go to the moon together, the Russians and the Americans? And not only did he make a speech about it in the United Nations, but he issued a National Security Action Memorandum to the head of NASA, James Webb. Now, I'm doing this from memory. As I recall, I believe that NSAM to the head of NASA went out in early November '63, but it ordered Webb to begin planning for a joint lunar landings with the Soviets, and it told Webb, you will be the single point of contact. I want you to get it going and report back to me in December. And that NSAM was actually signed by President Kennedy. And so this could not have made anyone in the so-called military-industrial complex happy at all. So that's a real indication of where his mind was in '63, because he knew how symbolic that would have been. I think he understood that it could have been the symbol of the end of the Cold War.
This is the